"It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other choice," said the shivering young Apache woman. A cold wind swept across the snowy landscape, rattling the branches of the sparse trees and carrying a bitter chill that cut straight through clothing. The young Apache woman wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering despite her best efforts. She had been walking for hours, her boots sinking slightly into the soft snow with every careful step. The trail she followed was familiar, yet the storm made even the simplest path treacherous. Her breath came out in misty clouds, and each one seemed to vanish into the white horizon. She could see the shadows of the cliffs ahead, but the snowfall made it impossible to tell exactly how far she had to go. Her heart pounded, not only from the effort of walking through the snow, but from the growing fear that the storm would trap her far from safety. She stopped for a moment, letting herself catch her breath and scan the area. The wind howled, echoing off the distant rocks, making it seem as if the mountains themselves were alive. The young woman's hands were numb, and her fingers ached despite being tucked inside the sleeves of her coat. She tucked them closer to her chest and tried to focus on the path ahead. Her family's small home lay beyond the cliffs, and she had promised herself she would reach it before nightfall. The snowstorm, however, seemed to have its own plans. She could barely see her feet, and the familiar trail was quickly being swallowed by the falling snow. Her stomach twisted with worry. She had supplies with her, some food and blankets, but she knew that if she could not find shelter soon, survival would be difficult. The thought of being alone in this storm made her shiver even harder. She knew the mountains were beautiful in the daylight, but at night, under a heavy snowstorm, they could be merciless. The wind seemed to whisper threats as it tore through the trees, and each gust made her fear that she might be caught in a hidden crevice or lose her footing on a slippery rock. Her heart felt heavier with each step, but she pressed on. She had learned from her elders that perseverance was essential in moments like this. Just as despair began to creep in, she spotted a dark shape ahead. Through the thick falling snow, it looked like a small structure, possibly abandoned. Her spirits lifted slightly. Even if it was only a small rock overhang, it could provide shelter from the storm. She quickened her pace, feeling a glimmer of hope. But the storm had other ideas. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked her off balance, and she had to grab onto a tree trunk to steady herself. The snow stung her face, and she realized that without some shelter, the night would be long and dangerous. As she drew closer, she noticed that the structure was not as empty as she first thought. There was a figure huddled near the entrance, half hidden by the snow. The man looked older, probably in his 40s, with a rugged face and clothes that were already wet from the storm. He seemed as trapped by the storm as she was. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. But the thought of staying alone in the storm outweighed her fear of strangers. Slowly, she stepped forward, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The man noticed her immediately and straightened, brushing the snow from his coat. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he called over the wind, his voice hoarse but steady. She nodded, her words lost in the gusts. She gestured toward the small shelter, and he understood. He made room for her inside, and she quickly stepped in, grateful for the momentary relief from the wind. The inside of the shelter was cramped, barely enough space for the two of them. The walls were made of stone, and a small broken window let in a little light, though the snow still blew in. The air was cold and damp, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the dim light. The man motioned toward a corner where there were some dry twigs and branches. Together, they managed to start a small fire. The flames sputtered and danced, offering warmth that slowly spread through the room. She sat close to it, rubbing her hands, feeling some of the chill leave her body. She introduced herself quietly, using her first name, though she didn't know if he would remember it. The man replied with his own name, and they exchanged a few words, mostly about the storm and the danger it presented. He explained that he had been traveling through the mountains and had not expected the snowfall to be this heavy. She listened, nodding, grateful for the human connection in a place that suddenly felt enormous and threatening. As the wind howled outside, the two of them sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm. The young woman shivered again, realizing how close she was to the edge of exhaustion. Her fingers and toes were numb, and the small fire did little to chase away the cold entirely. She hugged her knees to her chest and whispered to herself, "It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other choice." The words were almost a prayer, a recognition of the reality they faced. The storm had trapped them together, and survival depended on cooperation, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it might feel. The man glanced at her, noticing her shivering. He gestured toward his coat, offering some extra warmth. She accepted it gratefully, and for a moment the tension between them eased. They shared a quiet understanding, both strangers, both vulnerable, but both alive and determined to survive. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, the small fire and the tiny shelter became a fragile island of safety. Hours passed slowly. The young woman tried to keep her mind occupied by focusing on her surroundings. She noticed small details. The way the fire flickered against the stone walls, the way the man's eyes occasionally reflected the orange glow, and the rhythmic sound of the wind against the shelter. She realized that even in danger, there was beauty in noticing the small things, in feeling the warmth of a fire, and in knowing someone else was sharing the struggle with her. The man, too, began to open up. He spoke about the mountains, the challenges of living and working in such remote areas, and the importance of preparation. She listened carefully, learning from his experiences. They began to share strategies for keeping warm and safe during the storm. The young woman recounted what she had learned from her elders, teaching him a few tricks for using blankets, twigs, and even mud to insulate against the cold. For the first time since the storm began, they felt a sense of control, however small, over their situation. As night fell, the wind's howls grew louder, and the snow piled higher against the entrance of the shelter. The young woman felt the weight of the storm pressing against the fragile walls, but she also felt a growing sense of determination. She realized that fear alone would not help her survive. Only courage, patience, and careful thought could see her through. The man seemed to sense this as well. He kept watch near the entrance, listening to the storm and occasionally adjusting the fire. Neither spoke much, but their silent cooperation was powerful. Eventually, fatigue overcame them. They huddled closer to the fire, sharing warmth as best they could. The young woman's eyes grew heavy, and she leaned slightly against the wall, feeling the steady presence of the man beside her. The storm continued to rage, but inside, there was a small pocket of safety, trust, and shared resilience. Even in her exhaustion, she could not stop thinking about the words she had whispered earlier. "It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other choice." They were not just words. They were a promise to herself to survive, to endure, and to rely on the unexpected ally beside her. She closed her eyes, letting herself rest, knowing that the storm had not yet passed and that the coming hours would test both their courage and resourcefulness. But for now, in that small, fragile shelter, she felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, human connection and determination could offer warmth stronger than any fire. And as the night stretched on, the storm outside seemed endless, but inside, the young Apache woman and the rugged traveler huddled together, waiting, planning, and surviving. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, they had found the first fragile thread of safety, a small light in the darkness, and the courage to face whatever would come next. The first light of morning filtered weakly through the small, cracked window of the shelter. The storm outside had lessened slightly, though the wind still howled and the snow continued to fall, drifting against the walls like tiny white ghosts. The young Apache woman stirred, rubbing her eyes and stretching her stiff limbs. Her body ached from the cold and from sleeping on the hard stone floor, but she was alive, and the small fire still smoldered in the corner. She felt a flicker of relief, though it was mixed with worry. The storm was far from over, and she knew that leaving the shelter too early could be dangerous. The man beside her shifted, stirring awake. He had slept sitting up, leaning against the wall, his coat wrapped tightly around him. When he saw that she was awake, he gave a small nod and she returned it. There was no need for many words. They understood each other well enough. Survival had a language of its own, and they had begun to learn it in the night. The fire was weak, so the woman gently blew on it, coaxing the flames back to life. The man gathered more twigs and branches, some damp but usable, and added them carefully. Soon, the small fire crackled again, sending warmth into the cramped space. They did not speak much at first. Both were exhausted from the night, and the storm had drained their energy. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was filled with shared understanding. Each knew that the other was a partner in survival, and that trust, even fragile, was essential. The young woman noticed how the man's hands were rough and scarred, evidence of a life spent working hard in the mountains. He noticed how her eyes, sharp and alert despite her exhaustion, scanned the shelter constantly, aware of every sound, every movement. They were learning each other in subtle ways, through observation and small gestures. After a while, the man broke the silence. "We should try to find better shelter," he said softly. His voice was calm but carried the weight of caution. "This place is small, and if the snow keeps piling, it might not hold for long." The young woman nodded. She had thought the same thing. She was shivering again, and the fire alone could not keep the cold entirely away. The wind outside was relentless, pushing snow through the tiny cracks and making the room feel colder than it actually was. "We need to wait a little," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling. "The storm is still strong. If we try to leave now, we might get lost or trapped. We need to be smart." The man agreed. They settled into a careful routine, keeping the fire alive, checking the roof for loose stones, and listening to the storm outside. Every now and then, the young woman would glance out the window, trying to see if the storm had passed enough to make travel safe. Each time, the snow blurred the view, hiding the path ahead. Hours passed, and the two of them began to talk more. The young woman spoke first, telling the man about her life in the Apache community. She spoke of her family, the lessons taught by her elders, and the traditions that shaped her understanding of the land. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, and for a moment, the shelter felt less like a prison and more like a place of connection. The man listened intently, asking questions and sharing stories of his own life. He spoke of the mountains, the seasons, and the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. Slowly, they discovered that they had more in common than they first realized. As they spoke, the young woman remembered a lesson her grandmother had taught her. In harsh conditions, the mind was as important as the body. Fear could be deadly, but hope, courage, and careful thinking could make the difference between life and death. She shared this with the man, and he nodded, clearly impressed by her wisdom. Together, they began to plan, thinking about what they would do when the storm finally calmed. They discussed how to move safely through the snow, how to conserve energy, and how to protect themselves from exposure. The fire burned lower, and the cold began to seep back in. The young woman huddled closer to the man, not out of discomfort but out of necessity. They shared warmth in the simplest way possible, leaning close to each other while keeping a careful distance to remain comfortable. There was a quiet intimacy in their cooperation, a growing respect that did not need words. The man showed her a small trick he used to keep his hands warm, and she shared a technique for wrapping blankets to trap heat. Each small exchange strengthened their bond and gave them hope. As the morning passed into afternoon, the snow began to pile higher outside. The shelter, though small, was proving its worth. They kept watch over the weak walls, reinforcing weak spots with stones and branches. The young woman noticed that some of the snow had formed a small drift near the entrance, almost blocking the way. She realized that if the storm worsened, they could be trapped for longer than they expected. Together, they cleared a path, carefully shoveling snow with bare hands and whatever tools they could find. The work was exhausting, but it kept their bodies warm and gave them a sense of control over the situation. During a brief lull in the storm, the man ventured outside to check the surroundings. The young woman watched from the window, her breath fogging the glass. She could see him moving carefully, testing the snow and the stability of the rocks. He called to her when he found a safer path, and she felt a surge of relief. Their planning and cautious efforts had paid off. They would be able to leave the shelter safely once the storm lessened. As they prepared for the journey ahead, the storm returned with a sudden fury. The wind screamed through the mountains, and snow whipped against the shelter walls. The young woman shivered violently, but this time it was not fear alone, it was the shock of the storm's power. The man quickly added more branches to the fire and encouraged her to move closer to the warmth. They spoke quietly to each other, offering reassurance and support. In that moment, the young woman realized how much she depended on this stranger and how he depended on her. Survival was not just about individual strength, it was about trust, cooperation, and courage. Night approached again, and the temperature dropped even further. They ate the small rations of food they had, sharing pieces of dried meat and small morsels of bread. Every bite was precious, but it gave them the energy they needed to endure the night. They wrapped themselves in blankets and huddled near the fire, speaking softly about their plans for when the storm ended. The young woman thought about her family and how worried they must be. She felt a deep longing to return home, to the warmth and safety she had left behind. But for now, she had to focus on survival, step by step, hour by hour. The night was long, filled with the howling wind and the relentless fall of snow. The young woman and the man took turns keeping watch, listening for signs of danger. Every small sound, the snap of a branch, the shift of snow on the roof, made them tense, ready to act. Despite the fear, there were moments of quiet connection. They shared stories, small jokes, and observations about the storm. Each moment of laughter or understanding eased the tension, making the cold seem a little less harsh. As the storm continued, the young woman's mind wandered to her earlier words. "It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other choice." She realized that those words were not just about the night, they were about life itself. Sometimes, survival meant relying on others, trusting strangers and facing challenges together. She felt a deep respect for the man beside her, and she sensed that he felt the same. They were no longer just two people trapped by a storm. They were partners in endurance, each giving strength to the other when it was most needed. Hours passed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind lessened, the snow fell more gently, and the sky showed hints of light behind the clouds. The young woman and the man knew that their chance to move safely was approaching. They prepared their small belongings, tested the stability of the shelter, and mentally mapped the path they would take. Their exhaustion was still present, but it was mixed with cautious hope. The worst of the storm had passed, and survival was within reach. Finally, just as dawn broke, the young woman stood at the entrance of the shelter, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had left a world transformed, white and silent, but no less dangerous. The man joined her, and they exchanged a determined glance. They knew that the next steps would be challenging, but they also knew that they had endured the night together. They had survived through cooperation, courage, and trust. And now, with careful planning and steady resolve, they could move forward, step by step, toward safety, toward warmth, and toward the lives waiting for them beyond the snow. The snow had stopped falling, but the air remained icy and sharp. The young Apache woman stepped cautiously outside the shelter, her boots sinking into the thick, uneven snow. The mountains looked different in the daylight after the storm. Everything was covered in white, and familiar landmarks were hidden beneath the snow. She frowned, realizing that navigating this transformed landscape would be far more difficult than she had expected. The man followed closely behind her, carrying what little supplies they had salvaged from the shelter. Together they moved slowly, deliberately, each step requiring focus and balance. The cold was relentless. Even with layers of clothing and blankets wrapped around their shoulders, the wind cut through their coats. The young woman pulled her shawl tighter and rubbed her hands together, trying to restore warmth. Her fingers were stiff and sore, and every movement required effort. She glanced at the man beside her. He looked equally exhausted, his face pale from the cold, his movements careful and calculated. Both of them knew that one wrong step could lead to injury, or worse, being trapped in the snow with no way to reach safety. As they moved forward, the woman tried to keep her spirits high. She remembered what her elders had told her about the mountains. Even in danger, there was always a way forward if one stayed calm and used the mind before the body. She led the way, carefully choosing the path between rocks and trees, testing the snow for hidden holes or slippery patches. The man followed her lead, trusting her instincts, and occasionally pointing out places that looked unstable. They worked as a team, silently coordinating movements, adjusting pace, and using hand signals to communicate over the sound of the wind. Despite their careful progress, the journey was exhausting. The snow was deep in some areas, and every step required significant energy. The young woman's legs ached, her lungs burned from the cold air, and her boots were wet from the melting snow. She stopped for a moment to catch her breath, leaning on a tree for support. The man paused beside her, his expression serious but calm. "We need to rest, even for a few minutes," he said softly. "The storm is gone, but the cold can still be dangerous. If we push too hard, we could make mistakes." She nodded, grateful for the caution. They found a small outcrop of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind and crouched behind it, sharing warmth and drinking the small amount of water they had left. As they rested, they began to talk again, trying to keep their minds focused and alert. The young woman spoke about her family, describing the small home she had left behind and the people she loved. She spoke about her life in the Apache community, the lessons of survival, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. The man listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the land and the traditions she had learned. He spoke of his own experiences, describing times when he had faced storms in the mountains before. Each story, each shared memory, strengthened their bond and reminded them that they were not alone in facing the challenges of the wilderness. Once they had regained a little strength, they continued their journey. The landscape had changed drastically in the snow. Rocks that were normally visible were hidden beneath a thick layer of ice and snow, making every step unpredictable. The young woman carefully tested each step with her staff, ensuring that the ground was solid. The man followed closely, helping her where needed and keeping an eye on possible dangers. At one point, the snow gave way beneath her foot, and she nearly slipped down a small slope. The man reached out instantly, grabbing her arm and steadying her. They shared a brief, grateful smile, silently acknowledging the growing trust between them. Hours passed as they moved through the white wilderness. The wind occasionally picked up again, gusting through the mountains and sending tiny clouds of snow into their faces. They pressed on, understanding that stopping for too long could be just as dangerous as moving too quickly. Their conversation continued, soft and steady, designed to distract them from the fatigue and fear. They spoke about small joys, the warmth of a fire, the taste of food, and the promise of safety ahead. Even in the harshest conditions, these small moments of hope kept their spirits alive. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the mountains. The young woman froze, her heart pounding. She glanced around, trying to locate the source. A large tree branch, weakened by the storm, had broken and fallen onto the snow. The man immediately moved to help, checking the surrounding area for more potential hazards. The sound reminded them both that the environment was still unpredictable and dangerous. Even though the storm had passed, nature was still capable of surprising them, testing their courage and awareness. They continued cautiously, moving slower and more deliberately. The snow underfoot was deep and uneven, hiding small dips and hidden streams. At one point, the young woman spotted a faint trail in the snow, likely made by a deer or other small animal. She pointed it out to the man. "This could lead to water or shelter," she said quietly. They decided to follow the trail, careful not to disturb it too much. Each step was a careful calculation, balancing speed with safety. By late afternoon, exhaustion had set in again. The young woman's legs ached, and her fingers were numb despite being wrapped tightly. The man suggested finding a more secure resting place before darkness fell. They discovered a small cave, partially hidden by snow and rocks. It was not large, but it offered protection from the wind and any falling snow. Inside, they found a flat area where they could sit and rest. The young woman checked the cave carefully for loose rocks or signs of danger, and the man helped reinforce the entrance with branches and stones. Together, they made it as safe as possible. Inside the cave, they shared what little food and water remained. Each bite and sip was precious, but it kept them alert and gave them energy. The young woman wrapped herself in blankets and leaned close to the fire they had managed to start using small, dry twigs. The man did the same, and they both felt a measure of comfort in the shared warmth. They spoke quietly about the path ahead, trying to anticipate any obstacles they might face. The young woman explained how the terrain could be treacherous, and the man shared his knowledge of safer routes. Together, they planned carefully, understanding that teamwork was their best chance of surviving the remaining challenges. Night began to fall again, and the temperature dropped sharply. The young woman shivered despite the layers of blankets and the small fire. She leaned slightly closer to the man, not out of discomfort but out of practicality. They needed to share body heat to conserve energy. He did the same, and for a brief moment they shared a quiet connection, a bond formed through shared struggle and mutual dependence. Neither spoke much, but the presence of another person, equally determined to survive, provided comfort stronger than any words. Throughout the night, the storm's aftermath continued to make their journey dangerous. Snow occasionally shifted, small rocks tumbled from above, and the icy air made breathing difficult. They took turns keeping watch, listening for any signs of danger and monitoring the fire. The young woman reflected on her earlier words. "It's cold, it's just the two of us, there's no other choice." The truth of them had become even clearer. In this harsh landscape, survival required courage, trust, and reliance on another human being. The bond between them, formed in the face of adversity, was their greatest strength. As dawn approached, the wind began to die down further. The snow had settled, leaving a pristine, silent landscape. The young woman and the man prepared to continue, their energy still limited but their determination strong. They carefully checked their path, reinforced weak spots in the terrain where snow had hidden dangerous dips, and made plans for the journey ahead. Each step would still be difficult, but they had proven to themselves that they could endure. Before leaving the cave, the man turned to the young woman and smiled faintly. "We've made it this far," he said. "Together, we can make it the rest of the way." She nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. The storm had tested them, had pushed them to their limits, and had shown them the strength of their own resolve. Now, as they stepped out into the cold, quiet world, they carried with them not only hope but the confidence that together they could survive whatever came next. The mountains stretched before them, white and silent, but no longer entirely threatening. Each step was still a challenge. each breath still a reminder of the cold. But the young woman and the man had learned that endurance, courage, and trust could guide them through even the harshest conditions. With careful steps and shared determination, they moved forward toward safety, toward warmth, and toward the lives waiting beyond the snow. The morning air was sharp and clear, but it offered little comfort. The snow that had fallen during the storm still blanketed the mountains, making every step slow and exhausting. The young Apache woman tightened the straps of her coat and pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. Her breath came out in small clouds, and every inhale carried a sharp bite of cold that made her chest ache. Beside her, the man moved carefully, scanning the white landscape, alert for hidden dangers. The quiet was almost complete, broken only by the occasional crunch of their boots in the deep snow. Despite the exhaustion of the previous night and day, they knew they had to keep moving. The cave they had used as shelter had given them a brief reprieve, but it was not safe to stay long. Snow continued to pile in the mountains, and even small avalanches could occur without warning. The young woman took the lead, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain for obstacles, hidden crevices, and unstable snowdrifts. The man followed closely, sometimes placing a steadying hand on her back or shoulder when the path became treacherous. Each small gesture reinforced their growing trust and reliance on one another. Hours passed as they carefully navigated the harsh terrain. Their legs ached from the effort of moving through deep snow, and their boots were soaked through. Every step required concentration, and every misstep could lead to injury. At one point, the woman noticed a patch of ice beneath the snow that was large and slippery. She froze for a moment, considering the risk. The man observed her hesitation and gently suggested an alternate path. She nodded, grateful for the guidance. Together, they found a safer route, testing each step carefully before moving forward. As they continued, they began to discuss their next moves in a practical, quiet way. The young woman suggested they look for a river or stream, which could help them find a clearer path and provide water. The man agreed, pointing out small animal tracks that might indicate the presence of running water nearby. They adjusted their course, moving toward what they hoped was the safest and most reliable route. Each decision was deliberate, carefully weighed against the risk of exhaustion or exposure. The cold was relentless. Their fingers and toes were numb despite thick gloves and layered socks. Every gust of wind seemed to pierce their coats and blankets, chilling them to the bone. The young woman stopped several times to rub her hands and toes, trying to restore circulation. The man did the same, and sometimes they shared a brief laugh at the absurdity of shivering so badly while so close to each other. The small moments of humor helped lift their spirits and reminded them that even in danger, human connection was a powerful source of warmth. As they moved, the young woman noticed something unusual ahead. A large rock formation jutted out from the snow, creating a small overhang. It could provide temporary shelter if the wind increased again. She signaled to the man, and they cautiously approached. Under the overhang, they found a spot where the snow had not accumulated as heavily. They paused to rest, leaning against the rocks and using their blankets to shield themselves from the wind. The fire they managed to start earlier had long since died, but the temporary shelter gave them enough protection to regain some strength. While resting, they spoke quietly about their lives. The young woman shared stories of her family and her community, describing lessons she had learned about resilience and courage. The man spoke of his own experiences in the mountains, recounting times when storms had tested him before. Each story strengthened their bond, and the shared moments of trust and understanding reminded them why cooperation was essential. The young woman realized that survival was not only about strength and skill, but also about the emotional support they provided each other. Eventually, they knew they had to move on. The path ahead was uncertain, but staying in one place for too long was just as dangerous as moving through the snow. The young woman led the way, her eyes constantly scanning for hidden crevices or weak ice. The man followed closely, offering help whenever the path became treacherous. At one point, the snow beneath the young woman's feet shifted unexpectedly, and she stumbled slightly. The man caught her arm, steadying her. She smiled briefly, grateful for the support, and they continued on, careful not to make the same mistake again. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion had begun to weigh heavily on both of them. Their movements were slower, their breaths heavier, and the cold had seeped deep into their bones. They found a small clearing where the snow was slightly less deep and decided to rest again. The young woman wrapped herself in her blankets and leaned against the man, sharing warmth as best they could. They ate a small portion of food, conserving their limited supplies. Each bite and sip of water was precious, but it gave them the energy they needed to continue. The journey resumed, each step more challenging than the last. The snow had hidden familiar landmarks, making navigation difficult. The young woman used her memory of the mountains, recalling the position of rocks, trees, and slopes to guide their path. The man followed her lead, trusting her knowledge and instinct. They moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that every careful step could mean the difference between safety and disaster. As night approached, the cold intensified. The wind picked up again, howling through the mountains like a living thing. The young woman and the man huddled together, using their shared body heat to stave off the biting air. They found a small depression in the snow, using rocks and branches to create a barrier against the wind. The snow around them continued to shift, and they knew they had to remain alert. Each sound, the crunch of snow, the snap of a branch, made them tense, ready to react instantly. In the quiet moments, the young woman reflected on her earlier words. "It's cold, it's just the two of us, there's no other choice." They had faced the storm together, relied on each other through exhaustion and fear, and now they were enduring the aftermath together. The words were no longer just about survival. They represented a shared determination, a promise to face challenges side by side. She realized that their partnership, formed out of necessity, had become a source of strength and comfort. Hours passed slowly as night settled over the mountains. The temperature dropped further, and they huddled close, conserving energy and warmth. They took turns keeping watch, listening for signs of danger and monitoring the fragile shelter they had created. The young woman admired the man's steady presence, his calm determination, and his willingness to work together. She knew that without his support, the journey would have been far more difficult. In turn, the man recognized her courage, her intelligence, and her resourcefulness. Together, they had endured challenges that neither could have faced alone. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them, and they allowed themselves to rest briefly. The night was long, filled with the sounds of the wind and the occasional shifting of snow, but they survived by relying on each other's presence and skill. The young woman thought about the warmth of a fire, the taste of food, and the safety of her home. She longed for those comforts, but she also understood that her strength, determination, and trust in the man beside her had carried her through the storm. As dawn approached, the wind lessened slightly, and the snow settled into a quiet, sparkling landscape. The young woman and the man prepared to continue, checking their path and gathering their limited supplies. The snow was still deep, and the journey would be difficult, but they had proven to themselves that they could endure. Each step forward was a triumph, a testament to their courage and perseverance. They moved cautiously, testing the snow before stepping, and using their knowledge of the terrain to guide their way. At one point, they came across a small stream, partially frozen but flowing enough to provide water. The young woman smiled, relieved to see it. They drank sparingly, replenishing their energy for the next stretch of their journey. The man used his hands to carefully clear ice from the edges, demonstrating his knowledge and care. Together, they navigated the stream, balancing on rocks and carefully stepping through the water without falling. The journey continued, step by step, hour by hour. The mountains were still dangerous, the cold still biting, but they were no longer alone in facing it. Their shared determination, trust, and cooperation had carried them this far, and they knew it would carry them farther. Every challenge they overcame strengthened their bond, deepened their respect for one another, and reinforced their belief that survival was possible even in the harshest conditions. By late afternoon, they found another temporary shelter, a small cluster of rocks partially hidden by snow. They huddled together again, sharing warmth and conserving energy for the final leg of their journey. The young woman reflected on the lessons of the past days. Patience, courage, and reliance on another human being were as important as any skill or piece of equipment. She realized that the man beside her had become more than a companion. He was a partner in endurance, a source of guidance and strength. As night fell once more, the temperature dropped sharply. The young woman and the man wrapped themselves tightly in blankets, huddling close to protect against the cold. They spoke quietly about the path ahead, sharing observations and plans. Their conversation was practical but filled with a sense of hope. The storm had tested them, but it had also taught them the value of trust, patience, and cooperation. They had survived together, and now they would continue to do so until they reached safety. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, white and silent under the moonlight. Each step remained a challenge, but the young woman and the man had learned to navigate them with determination and care. Their journey was far from over, but they had proven that courage, perseverance, and trust in one another could overcome even the harshest conditions. Together, they faced the cold, the snow, and the uncertainty, moving forward with hope, resilience, and the unspoken promise that they would survive. The morning air was calm and still, a sharp contrast to the fury of the storm they had endured. The snow glistened under the pale light, covering the mountains in a smooth, sparkling blanket. The young Apache woman stretched, feeling every ache in her body from the days of cold, exhaustion, and careful navigation. Her fingers were still stiff, and her legs ached, but a quiet determination had settled in her heart. She glanced at the man beside her. His face showed the same exhaustion, but there was a calm resolve in his eyes. They had survived the storm and its aftermath, but they still had a journey ahead before reaching safety. They began moving slowly, carefully picking their way through the snow-covered terrain. The mountains were treacherous, even after the storm had passed. Hidden crevices, slippery ice, and deep drifts of snow demanded their full attention. Each step required focus, and the young woman led the way, her memory of the land guiding them. She tested the snow before stepping, tapping it with her staff to ensure it was solid. The man followed closely, offering support whenever needed. Every step was deliberate, every movement careful, and every small success reinforced their hope. Hours passed, and fatigue weighed heavily on both of them. They stopped occasionally to rest, leaning against rocks or snowdrifts. During these pauses, they spoke quietly, sharing observations about the path ahead. The young woman pointed out landmarks she recognized from her earlier travels, and the man noted areas that looked safer to cross. Their cooperation was seamless, built over days of shared struggle. Neither needed to speak more than necessary. The bond they had formed was evident in their actions. By midday, they had reached a small valley where the snow was slightly less deep. A faint trail was visible, likely made by animals or previous travelers. The young woman's eyes brightened with cautious hope. "This could lead to the lower lands," she said softly. "If we follow it, we might reach people or shelter soon." The man nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. They adjusted their course, carefully following the faint trail, testing the snow at every step. The valley was quieter than the higher mountains, but the cold remained sharp. Their boots sank into the snow, and their movements were slow. Despite the exhaustion, they pressed on, understanding that stopping too long could be dangerous. The young woman felt a deep sense of connection with the man beside her. He had become more than a companion. He was a partner, someone who shared her fears, hopes, and determination. The trust between them was no longer fragile. It was steady and unspoken, a quiet force that kept them moving forward. As they moved, the woman noticed faint signs of life ahead. A small plume of smoke rose in the distance, likely from a cabin or camp. Her heart leapt with cautious excitement. She pointed it out to the man, who adjusted their direction. They quickened their pace slightly, careful not to slip, but driven by the hope of rescue. The thought of seeing other people, of finding warmth and safety, gave them renewed energy. Every step felt lighter, even as their muscles ached. Approaching the source of the smoke, they discovered a small group of homes partially buried in snow. The people there were cautious but welcoming, immediately recognizing the exhaustion and peril in the travelers' faces. The young woman and the man were guided into a warm cabin, where a fire roared in the hearth. The warmth was almost overwhelming, and the woman sank to her knees, wrapping her hands around the heat. Tears welled in her eyes as the man smiled, relief evident in his expression. They had survived. The people in the cabin offered blankets, food, and hot tea. The young woman drank slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through her body. The man accepted the same, nodding in gratitude. For the first time in days, they could rest without fear of the cold, of slipping, or of snow burying them. The storm had tested them in every way, but now they could finally breathe, knowing they were safe. As they rested, they reflected on their journey. The young woman spoke softly about the lessons she had learned: patience, courage, and the importance of trust. She realized that without the man beside her, she might not have survived. He had been her support, her guide, and her companion in the most dangerous conditions. The man, in turn, expressed his gratitude and admiration for her strength, resilience, and knowledge of the land. They shared a quiet understanding that went beyond words, a bond forged in the harshest circumstances. Later, the local people offered to guide them to the main settlement, where they could find their families or make arrangements to return home. The young woman and the man accepted, moving slowly but steadily. The path was safer now, with clearer trails and less snow, but they remained cautious. Every step reminded them of the storm and the challenges they had faced. Yet the fear that had dominated their journey was replaced with hope and relief. As they traveled, the young woman looked around at the transformed landscape. The mountains were still beautiful, but the harshness of nature was undeniable. She thought about her earlier words. "It's cold, it's just the two of us. There's no other choice." They had been more than words. They had been a guide, a reminder that survival often requires partnership, courage, and the strength to keep moving forward despite fear. By evening, they reached the main settlement. People recognized the signs of travelers who had endured the storm: frozen hair, red cheeks, and tired eyes. Friends and family of the young woman rushed to her, wrapping her in warm blankets and expressing relief that she had survived. She smiled through tears, feeling the comfort of being home and the joy of sharing her survival with loved ones. The man stood beside her, quietly observing, and a few people welcomed him warmly as well. His presence had been essential to her survival, and they recognized it. After they had rested and shared food, the young woman and the man spoke quietly about the journey ahead. Though they had survived the storm, they knew that the lessons learned would remain with them forever. The importance of trust, patience, and cooperation was clear, as was the strength found in shared determination. They had endured hardship together and emerged stronger, with a bond that could not easily be broken. In the quiet moments that followed, the young woman reflected on the experience. The storm had been merciless, the cold biting and the journey exhausting, yet she had survived. She had relied on her instincts, her knowledge, and her courage, but also on the support of the man beside her. Together, they had faced a world transformed by nature, and together they had emerged victorious. The memory of the storm, the fear, and the shared moments of warmth and trust would stay with her forever. The man, too, reflected on the journey. He had seen the young woman's strength and determination firsthand, and he had learned the importance of cooperation and trust in the face of danger. He realized that survival was rarely a solitary endeavor. It was the shared effort, the quiet support, and the moments of understanding that made the difference between life and death. He respected her deeply and knew that the bond they had formed would never fade. As night fell over the settlement, the young woman and the man sat near the fire in the cabin. The warmth was comforting, the cold of the mountains a distant memory. They spoke quietly, sharing stories of the journey and expressing gratitude for the other's courage and strength. The young woman smiled, thinking of how far they had come from the moment they had huddled together in that small, fragile shelter. The man nodded, sharing the quiet satisfaction of having survived and helped someone else survive. Finally, as the fire burned low and the night deepened, they allowed themselves to rest completely. The journey was over. They had faced fear, exhaustion, and the raw power of nature, yet they had endured. The young woman felt a deep sense of peace, surrounded by warmth, safety, and the knowledge that she had survived not just through her own courage, but through partnership and trust. The man shared the same peace, understanding that their shared experience had created a bond stronger than any fear or hardship they had faced. In the early hours of the morning, the young woman awoke to the sound of the fire crackling and the quiet voices of people in the cabin. She looked beside her and saw the man, still resting but calm, a faint smile on his lips. She felt gratitude for him, for the lessons they had learned, and for the journey that had tested them so completely. Though the mountains remained outside, silent and snow-covered, she knew that the experience had changed her forever. She was stronger, braver, and more resilient, and she had discovered the power of trust, courage, and human connection in the face of life's harshest challenges. As she prepared to leave the cabin and reunite with her family, the young woman felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The storm had tested her limits, but she had survived. She had relied on her instincts, her knowledge, and the courage of the man who had walked beside her. Together, they had endured the cold, the snow, and the uncertainty, and now they could finally step into warmth, safety, and the comfort of being alive. Walking outside, she breathed in the crisp mountain air, feeling the sting of cold only as a reminder of the storm they had conquered. The snow sparkled under the early morning sun, a silent witness to their journey. She glanced at the man and they shared a quiet smile. No words were necessary. Their shared experience spoke for itself. They had survived together, and that knowledge, that bond, would remain with them forever.